Hello and welcome to the lecture on what is class. Let's understand what is class, how do you define it, and what is the purpose of it. So in this lecture, we will cover two topics. First is we'll explain what is class, we'll understand the class definition. Then we'll understand how to start organizing things in classes. Okay, so let's move on and look into these things. Well, in the previous lecture, we started thinking in objects. We said everything that we define in our programming style, we first have to define it as an object. Okay, so we talked about car object, phone object, video object, database, then your files and folders, users, mail, and download. So anything that you are writing a program, you have to first define them into objects. Then what is classes? Right, class is basically a blueprint of an object. Well, class is a specification or a definition of an object. Where an object is basically something you can start using it. Class is just a specification, like a documentation of that object. Okay, so let's understand what is the definition of a class. Class is a logical grouping of code with variables and function specific to that object. So the first step is you identify an object. Let's say you're writing about a video player. So you say, okay, I'm going to create a video player object. So you start grouping your code and into variables and functions into that class, and you create a class with variables and functions operating on that object, and that object could be a video object or database object or a user object. So if you're doing a database object, then when you define a class for the database, the variables could be the connection of that database, and the function is to do a query, insert the records, delete the records, those type of functions specific to that object. We're still calling it as variable and functions. We have a separate lecture on it where we're going to understand why variables are called as properties and why functions are called as methods and how to properly use them. But as of now, we will continue to use variable and functions till we reach to that lecture. Okay, so for the definition of a class, class is a blueprint of an object, which is a logical grouping of your code with variables and functions specific to that object. The main purpose of the class is to organize your code into individual components. So if you're writing a program, then you have to split your program into components, and then you have to say what component it is, what object it is. And when you write your class, you basically arrange all your variables and functions specific to that component or an object. Okay, so let's look into more details of how to define it and how to organize it. Imagine you're trying to define a car, right? Car is an object. Then what is a class? Class is basically a specification. It's a documentation, or it could be a definition of what are the things required to make a car. So it's something like a blueprint where you define all the components of a car. And what is an object? Object is basically the physical representation or the active version or the implemented version of that specification. Okay, so something which is not real but a specification is basically called as class. Objects are real and can be used. You cannot use the class directly. You have to create an object of a class to use its variables and functions. Okay, so let's move on. So organizing in class, basically when you think about objects, right, you have to first organize them into class. The first step is to define a class. Then you have to convert them into an object and use it. So if you have a car object, as you're discussing about thinking in objects, the car object can be defined as a car class. Then phone object can be defined as a phone class, and then video class, database class, files class, user class, email class, and downloads class. So you'll start creating these classes, and each class basically holds variables and functions that is operating on that specific object. If you define about the car will have its own variables and functions. The phone will have its own variables and function. The function of phone could be different from a function from a video. The function of a phone is to send message, make a call. The function of a video could be to play a video, load a video, all this buffering a video. So that features of that component will be written in that function in the specific classes. Okay, so you have to start thinking in object, and you have to start organizing your program into classes. When I say organize your program into classes, means organizing your piece of code which has variables and functions into that class. Okay, So let's organize a car class. So let's say you have a car class. Now you have to organize your program into this car class. So typically you have variables and functions. So variable of a car could be name and a color, and functions of that car could be set the name, set the color, and then display the name and the color. Well, without the object oriented programming, you could have just defined the variables and print them. But now you started thinking in objects. You have to define a class first, which is a specification or a blueprint of an object where you organize your code into variables and functions specific to that car. So whatever the variables that is required for the car class to operate, you will define that in the class. So let's look at how to organize in classes. You have to identify how you can organize your code into objects, example users, database, files, and posts. That is the first step. Then you start grouping them into classes, because you cannot start defining an object. An object is defined from a class. So first step is to define the classes. And each class has variables and functions into related individual objects. As we've seen previously, car has its own variable and functions operating on that specific class. Similarly, you define each classes for each objects that you're thinking to organize your code. And one class will hold many variables and functions, but is logically represent to that object. Which means when you define users, you don't define database variable and functions inside the users. The user variable and functions will operate logically in that specific object. Okay, let's look one more example of how to define a class. So think how to organize. If you're doing an users class, well, take a second and think, if you're doing a users class, how are you going to organize your variable and functions, and what are the variables that you need for a users class? Think for a second. Okay, so for the variables, you have name and age that is specific to that users. Then you have functions like set the name, set the age, display the name and age. So here you're not combining other object details into this object. This class only defines variables and functions specific to that class. Okay, if it's users, then you're talking only about name and age and some of the details of that users, and functions are basically the methods operating on that variables or specific to that users class. Okay, that's how you have to organize your code into classes. So let's do a quick recap. Class is a blueprint of an object. So class is basically a specification, a definition, or documentation of how you're going to organize your code into variables and functions. An object is something you create from a class and use it. Classes help you to organize the variable and functions to individual components, and one class described about one object's variable and function. This is very important to understand. You have to have this concept of one class is one object and all the variables and functions are specific to that object. Well, you have to have this mindset very clear. When you define one class, that class should represent one object and all the variables and functions should be specific to that class. Okay, never mix and match between variables and functions related to two different classes into one class. Okay, so let's summarize this. So you have to start organizing in classes. Previously, we start thinking in objects. Now you have to start organizing your code into classes. You have to have this mindset, because without this mindset of organizing things into classes and objects, you won't be able to write much in OOPS. So when you start thinking of OOPS, you have to organize in classes. So the first step is to identify classes in your program. So whatever program that you have written so far, you might be having a calculator program, or you might be having a file operation program, or basically a data that has been converted into CSV or any web page that you have. Well, the first step is to identify classes. You have to see your program and say, what is the class that I will be creating for this kind of program? What is the logical grouping of my code? How many classes I have to create to organize my code, and what are the objects that is required part of this code? Okay, so start defining the classes. You may not be defining by writing it, but start defining mentally. It's a specification, so you have to understand what are the classes you're actually writing it. So take a program that you have and start defining that into classes. Okay, remember this one thing always in your mind, that classes are specifications and are not real. You're not using classes to print or to call a method or basically to assign a value. Classes are specification, they're just definitions or documentations. Well, objects are real, so you create an object of a class and then you start using the variables and methods defined inside the classes. So let's do a quick summary of what you have learned. So by now you should explain what is class, what is the purpose of the class, and how to organize your program into classes. You have to understand this concept very clear. You should know how to think in objects, and you should know what is classes and how to organize your program into classes. Well, that's all for this lecture on what is class, and I'll see you in the next lecture.